For the rationalist trustingly pursues his light of nature and really thinks, in complete earnestness, that 40 or 50 years ago, before his papa with his nightcap conceived him and his mama goose deposited him safely into this world, that he purely and absolutely was nothing and then arose straight out of nothing. In case it isn't clear, the quote at the start of this video should be read with a great deal of sarcasm. Schopenhauer does not believe that an individual was an absolute nothing before being born, nor does he believe that we are an absolute nothing after we die. We've covered his views on death and what happens after it, and the metaphysics surrounding it, in a Patreon-exclusive video on the channel. But the quote at the beginning does illustrate one of Schopenhauer's pet peeves, namely his dislike of rationalism and what we may call crude materialism, the belief that there exists nothing beyond the material and that metaphysics is useless or not quote-unquote real. Throughout his writings, Schopenhauer harps on the physicists who look down upon metaphysics and dismiss it as philosophical fables that have no bearing on the real world. These physicists argue that physics is all one needs to explain the world, and consequently that metaphysics is useless at best and harmful at worst. In the Parerga and Paralipomena, a collection of essays that serve as a supplement to his main philosophy, but which can be read on their own, Schopenhauer penned down some remarks on the starting point of philosophy. He argues that there are two possible starting points for any philosophical investigation. Either you take an objective starting point or a subjective one. What does he mean by this? A subjective starting point is any philosophy that begins with the mind or perception or consciousness. The philosophy of Descartes is the clearest example, epitomized by the phrase, "I think, therefore I am." But Schopenhauer names Locke and Berkeley as examples, as well as Immanuel Kant, who, in his estimation, reached the peak in this subjective way of thinking. Kant, like Locke and Berkeley, but different in some key aspects, thought that the world is essentially mental, or at any rate, that there is an essential mental quality to the world. That's why his philosophy is called idealism. It's also transcendental because it differs in some important ways from the idealism of Locke and Berkeley, but these details need not concern us here. What matters is that Kant, Locke and Berkeley all assumed the world to be mental, if not entirely, then at least in essential part. This is why they chose, according to Schopenhauer, a subjective starting point for their philosophy. A philosophy of this kind will tend to focus on how the mind works and how it comes to knowledge of the world through its mechanisms. An objective standpoint, then, logically, is the opposite. This starting point takes the world, or nature, or matter, or the universe as its beginning. A philosophy of this kind will end up with a focus on the relationships between objects, the laws of nature, the forces at work, the interactions between materials, etc. A philosophy which regards the material world as the only thing that is absolutely given will inevitably become just a form of physics. And indeed, up until recently, people used the term natural philosophy to refer to disciplines which we would today call biology, chemistry, physics, and so on. The problem with this viewpoint is that it precludes any notion of metaphysics. But it's tricky, because it looks like this physical explanation for the world is both clear and deep. It therefore looks like a satisfactory explanation. So in this view, metaphysics aren't just impossible, they're also unnecessary. Judging accordingly from this standpoint, it seems nothing but a mere whim to seek different explanations for a world rendered so clearly, using an entirely imaginary metaphysics. On this is based the considerable contempt with which physicists look down upon metaphysics. However, the one-sidedness of this viewpoint will quickly reveal itself. Physicists cannot account for the question of where these natural laws come from. Thus, they are relegated to either plead ignorance or engage in tautology. In this respect, Schopenhauer remarks, with a good deal of sarcasm, that one could apply a phrase to the entire world thus explicated, one which Fichte was fond of uttering when he mustered his dramatic talents at the podium to say, in all earnestness, with impressive emphasis and a look that totally baffled his students, "It is because it is, and is as it is because it is so." Objective philosophies like materialism will inevitably go down the same path, Schopenhauer predicts. We should note that Schopenhauer is biased, of course, being an idealist himself. But he makes the argument that sooner or later these physicists will come to the conclusion that all knowledge of the world, however self-sufficient and mathematically correct it may be, is ultimately mediated by human cognition, and therefore that the human intellect, not the physical world, should be the chief object of philosophical investigation. Wisdom obtained according to objective means is accepted on the credit of the human intellect, which must, after all, have its own forms, functions, and manner of presentation, and consequently is entirely conditioned by it. From this follows the necessity to change standpoint once again, and switch method from objective to subjective, thereby making the intellect itself the focus of investigation and putting its authority to the test. So what is the true object of philosophy? It is to investigate the intellect itself. The greatest accomplishment in this endeavor, according to Schopenhauer, is Kant's masterpiece, The Critique of Pure Reason. However, this investigation must necessarily lead to the conclusion that not even the intellect itself is unmediated. For the intellect grasps merely the surface of things, but cannot penetrate to their interior, and therefore it is not entirely and thoroughly capable of understanding or scrutinizing even a single one, even the smallest and simplest of all those beings that are objectively clear and real to it. On the contrary, in each and everything, the main point remains a mystery to it. And this is indeed one of Kant's main conclusions in The Critique of Pure Reason, that metaphysics, or in other words, knowledge of the world as it is in itself, objectively, is fundamentally impossible. All we humans can do, in Kant's view, is formulate knowledge about the world as appearance, as the phenomenon. At this critical juncture, however, Schopenhauer moves away from Kant. Somehow cryptically and dramatically, Schopenhauer ends his essay on the possible starting point of philosophy with a cliffhanger. Then finally he recognizes that the ideality of space, time, and causality that is now clear to him leaves room for an entirely different order of things than that of nature. For Kant, this different order of things than nature is the noumenon, or the thing in itself. As we've seen, it's essentially unknowable, a mystery. We know that it exists, but we can say nothing more definite about it. For Schopenhauer, this is not the case. Schopenhauer does believe we can say something about this different order of things. He doesn't say it in this essay, but what he is hinting at is of course his own philosophy, the philosophy of the will. This very short essay, some isolated remarks on the correct starting point of philosophy, in this way serves as a sort of prologue and justification for his own philosophy. It's not really a defense of idealism per se, because Schopenhauer simply posits that a materialistic philosophy will never truly explain the world, without giving actual arguments for this position. Rather than a defense, then, it's more of a justification, an explanation. It's also a warning against his fellow philosophers to not relegate themselves to a single path. Taking an objective starting point and never deviating from this leads to materialism and ensures that philosophy can never surpass physics. But taking a subjective standpoint will lead to idealism in the vein of Berkeley, who argued that material reality doesn't objectively exist at all, except as an idea in the mind. Transcendental idealism, put forward by Immanuel Kant, is the synthesis of these two positions, and it's what Schopenhauer considered to be Kant's greatest achievement. By working out a philosophy of the will, Schopenhauer saw himself building upon Kantian foundations, importing the transcendental idealist framework, but adding on top of this an element which he found missing in Kant, an element which would allow us to learn true metaphysical knowledge. We can then see how in Kant's philosophy, this tension between subjective and objective starting points gets resolved. And Schopenhauer, in turn, will take it one step further still. Because after Schopenhauer introduces the concept of the will, he looks again to nature, to the material world, to learn about its inner workings. In this way, his philosophy becomes full circle again. After importing Kant's transcendental idealism, he refers to nature again to say more about metaphysics. He goes from the subjective to the objective, straight back to the subjective. This was very important to Schopenhauer, as he believed that a true theory of metaphysics must account for physical phenomena as well. So we get long, vividly described passages, almost documentary-like, on several phenomena in nature of great literary quality, which are then explained in terms of the underlying will. In this way, Schopenhauer sought to incorporate the scientific findings of his day, mostly in biology, into his own philosophy, a true theory of everything, a fundamental groundwork upon which the rest of our knowledge can be built. We take a look at some of the most literary and notable passages concerning these phenomena in nature, on an exclusive video released on Patreon that serves as an addendum to this one. If you want to support the channel and watch other exclusive videos not uploaded to the main channel, kindly support us by clicking the link in the description. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.